My name is Rosalind Achebe. I am 44 years old. I want to start with the wedding. Not because the wedding is where the story ends, though it is close to where it ends. I want to start with the wedding because the wedding is where I learned the truth, and the truth arrived in the specific way that truths sometimes arrive. Not through any planned revelation or earned confrontation, but through the simple, ordinary accident of a man who had drunk too much champagne and who said something to his new wife in a quiet hallway that I was walking past at 11:43 at night on a Saturday in June. Her name was Carla Mensa. She had been my closest friend for 23 years, from the first week of our undergraduate program at Howard University in September of 2001, when we had been assigned to adjacent rooms in Drew Hall and had discovered, in the specific way of people who find each other at exactly the right moment of their lives, that we were the people each other had been looking for without knowing we were looking. His name was Marcus Brandt. They had been together for 4 years, and they had married that afternoon in a ceremony in Silver Spring, Maryland, at a venue that Carla had selected because of the specific light through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the late afternoon, which she had described to me in the specific way she described things she cared about, with complete focused attention to exactly the detail that made the thing matter to her. I was her maid of honor. I had been her maid of honor not because it was expected, though it was, but because she had asked me in the specific way she asked me things that mattered, directly and with the full weight of the asking in her voice. I had planned the bridal shower and the bachelorette and the specific logistics of the day itself with the same care I brought to everything I did for Carla across 23 years of friendship, which was the specific, complete care of someone who understood that caring for someone they love was itself a form of love. At 11:43 in the evening, the reception winding toward its close, I was walking back from the bathroom in the eastern corridor of the venue when I heard Marcus's voice from around the corner where the corridor turned toward the coat room. He was not shouting. I want to be accurate about this. He was speaking with the specific elevated volume of someone who has had enough champagne to stop monitoring his own volume, not drunk in the falling down sense, but drunk in the specific sense of someone whose filters had loosened enough that the thing he was saying was coming out at the wrong amplitude for the privacy he probably intended. He said, "Carla, I need you to know that I know about the reference thing. I've known for 2 years. Carla's voice was lower. I stopped walking. She said, "Marcus, this is not the time." He said, "I know it's not the time. I know. But I need you to know that I know and that I think you need to tell Rosalind before she finds out some other way." She said something I could not hear. He said, "Because you've been doing it for 20 years and you're my wife now, and I don't want to be in a marriage where you're keeping that secret, and Rosalind is your best friend and she deserves to know." She said something else. Lower, he said, "Carla, I love you. I'm not trying to ruin the wedding. I'm trying to tell you that I know and that I think you should do the right thing." I stood in the corridor for 30 seconds after the voices stopped moving. Then I walked back to the main reception hall, and I found my seat, and I sat down, and I picked up the glass of water in front of me, and I drank it, and I thought for approximately 20 minutes, sitting at the table with the remains of the dinner and the specific hum of a wedding reception in its final hour around me, about what I had heard and what it could mean, and what the specific phrase the reference thing meant in the context of 23 years of friendship, and what it meant that Marcus had known for 2 years, and what it meant that Carla had not told me. Then I went home. I did not say anything to Carla that night, not because I was afraid to, because I understood, in the specific clarity that 23 years of close friendship had given me in how to handle things between us, that the conversation that was coming was not a conversation for the last hour of a wedding reception. It was a conversation for a different day, with different conditions, where both of us were fully present rather than one of us in a white dress in the final hour of the most significant day of her recent life. I drove home to my apartment in Washington, D.C., and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about a word. Reference. I thought about every job I had applied for across 23 years of professional life and had not gotten. I thought about the specific pattern of those not gettings, the particular shape of a professional life that had not quite arrived where it should have arrived, given what I had built and what I was capable of. I thought about the specific phone calls where I had listed Carla as a reference, because she had been a senior director at a nonprofit that operated in my professional field for 14 years, and because she was the person who knew my work most closely and whom I trusted most completely to speak to what I was capable of. I sat at my kitchen table at 1:30 in the morning on the day after my best friend's wedding, and I thought about the reference thing, and I felt something arrive in my understanding of 23 years that I want to describe precisely because the precision of the feeling is important. It was not immediate anger. It was the specific sensation of a very large number of small experiences reorganizing themselves against a new explanation, the particular feeling of things that have been separately inexplicable becoming, in a single moment, completely legible. Before I tell you what Carla told me when I called her 3 days after the wedding, let me take you to the beginning, because the beginning is where the specific shape of everything that followed was already present, and because the beginning is where I first understood what kind of friendship I was in, which is to say the kind that looks from the inside exactly like the deepest and most genuine friendship of your adult life, and that contained, in its specific texture, something I had never seen clearly enough to name. I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, the only child of Emeka and Adaeze Achebe, who had come to the United States from Nigeria in 1978 and who had built their American lives with the specific combination of professional achievement and community rootedness that characterized the Nigerian immigrant experience of their generation in the D.C. metro area. My father was an economist who spent 30 years at the World Bank, the specific kind of institutional career that takes someone from junior analyst to senior research fellow, through the particular combination of genuine expertise and the sustained reliability that institutions value in their long-term professionals. My mother had a doctorate in public health and spent her career between Johns Hopkins and the D.C. Department of Health, the work of someone who understood that the health of populations was both a scientific question and a political one, and who brought both kinds of intelligence to the question across 30 years. I grew up in a household organized around the specific values that my parents brought from Nigeria and adapted to their American professional lives, values that centered on education as both intrinsic good and practical necessity, on community and obligation, on the particular understanding that individual achievement was always in some sense communal, and that communal investment in individual achievement came with specific responsibilities of reciprocity. I was taught to work hard not primarily for personal gain, but because the work mattered, and because doing it well was itself a form of respect for the opportunities that had been given to me, and for the people who had worked to create those opportunities. I went to Howard University. This was not accidental and was not simply a matter of where I had been admitted, though I had been admitted to several schools. Howard was my parents' first choice for specific reasons they articulated clearly. They wanted me in an environment where Black excellence was the ambient standard rather than the exceptional case, where I would be surrounded by people who looked like me and who were achieving at the highest levels, where the specific context of a historically Black university would shape my understanding of what was possible and what was normal in ways that other environments would not provide. They were right about all of it. Howard was exactly what they described and exactly what I needed, and the 4 years I spent there were the years that built the most significant things about my adult self, the professional direction, and the specific intellectual framework and the friendships that I carried forward as the core relationships of my adult life. Carla was the most significant of those friendships. She was from Atlanta, the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants who had built professional lives in the Atlanta professional community, her father a surgeon and her mother a corporate attorney, a specific background that was similar to mine in its emphasis on achievement and its particular relationship to the immigrant's imperative to build something substantial from the opportunity that immigration had created. We recognized each other across this shared context immediately, in the way that people who have been raised inside similar value systems recognize each other in environments where those value systems are not universal. We were also simply suited to each other in the specific chemistry of friendship, which is not reducible to shared background or shared values, but that has a particular quality of ease and recognition that either exists between two people or does not, and that is visible very quickly when it does. She was funny in the specific way that I find most genuinely funny, which is the way of someone whose humor is built on accurate observation rather than performance. She was direct in the way I most value, saying what she meant and meaning what she said with the particular confidence of someone who has never felt the need to manage their meaning through indirection. She was ambitious in a way that I understood and respected, specifically organized around the work she cared about, which was nonprofit development and organizational capacity building, the work of helping organizations that were trying to do important things to do those things more effectively. We built the friendship across 4 years at Howard, and then maintained it across the 23 years after, through my move to D.C. and her move to Atlanta after graduation, and then her eventual return to D.C. 6 years later to take the senior director position at a nonprofit called the Center for Community Advancement, which was where she would spend the next 14 years. The friendship had the specific texture of close adult friendships, the regular phone calls and the annual visits and the specific closeness that develops between people who share a history and who have maintained the relationship across the years and the distances that adult life creates. We talked about work and about family and about the specific ongoing negotiations of adult life and about everything that mattered to each of us. And I trusted Carla's perspective on my life with the complete trust of someone who had known me since I was 18 years old and who had been present for everything that had shaped who I became. I want to tell you about my professional life before I tell you about the conversation with Carla, because the professional life is the specific substance of what the reference thing meant, and because the professional life requires accurate description to understand what happened to it. I studied public administration and nonprofit management at Howard, the specific direction of someone who had grown up watching her parents' professional lives and who had developed her own version of the same orientation, which was that the institutional mechanisms through which public good was delivered mattered as much as the good itself, and that understanding and improving those mechanisms was genuinely important work. I went directly to graduate school after Howard, a master's in public policy at Georgetown, and from Georgetown into the specific world of Washington, D.C., nonprofit and public sector work that I have inhabited for 23 years. I have worked in foundation program management and in government relations and in organizational development, and for the past 11 years I have been a senior consultant in a boutique firm that works with nonprofits and public agencies on organizational effectiveness, the work of someone who has built a genuine specific expertise across 2 decades in exactly the field she understood she was entering. I have done good work. I want to say this plainly, and without false modesty, because I think the plainness is necessary to understanding the full weight of what I am going to tell you. I am genuinely good at what I do. I have the specific combination of analytical capability and relational intelligence and sustained reliability that the work requires, and that clients can feel when they are working with someone who has it, rather than someone who is approximating it. My clients have told me this. My colleagues have told me this. The specific track record of outcomes I have produced for organizations across 23 years tells me this. What my professional life also contains is a specific pattern of large opportunities not taken, the particular shape of a career that has been substantively good without arriving at the specific levels that the combination of my qualifications and my work product and my 23-year track record should have produced. I have applied for positions across those 23 years, not obsessively, not constantly, but at the specific moments when an opportunity emerged that was the right size and the right fit for where I was and what I was building. I have made final rounds on 7 occasions. I have received 7 rejections. This is not an unusual number of rejections across 23 years of professional life. 7 rejections in 23 years is not the pattern of someone being systematically excluded. 7 rejections is the normal pattern of a competitive professional field. What is unusual is the specific quality of the rejections. 4 of the 7 were positions for which I was told, by the hiring organization and follow-up conversations where I requested feedback, that I had been the finalists committee's first choice before the reference check process. I had been the first choice before the reference check process. This is a specific and unusual thing to learn about yourself, and I had learned it about myself in 4 separate situations across 15 years, and each time I had absorbed the information and tried to understand what was happening in the reference check that was changing the outcome, and each time I had come to the same conclusion, which was that one of my references was providing a reference that undermined rather than supported my candidacy. I did not know which one. I had 7 people on my reference list across those years. Carla was one of them. There were 6 others. I had called each of them after each rejection, in the careful way of someone trying to understand what was happening without accusation. And each conversation had the quality of a conversation with someone who expressed genuine support and genuine confusion about the rejection, and who could not account for the reference check outcome. I had never called Carla, not because I did not trust her, because I trusted her more completely than I trusted any of the others, and because the trust I had in her made the thought of the conversation feel like an insult to something I did not want to insult. I had kept Carla on my reference list for 20 years because she was the most credible professional reference I had, the person with the most institutional standing in my field, the person who had known me longest and knew my work most specifically. I had kept her on my reference list because she was my best friend of 23 years, and I trusted her completely. She called me on the 3rd day after the wedding. Not the Tuesday after, which was the first full day back, but the Wednesday, which I understood as the day she had needed to build up to what she was calling to say. Her voice when she said my name had a quality I recognized immediately from 23 years of knowing her voice in all its specific registers. It was the voice she used when she had made a decision and was carrying it to the conversation. Not the voice of someone who did not know how to begin. The voice of someone who had been deciding how to begin for days and had arrived at the beginning. She said, "Rosalind, I need to tell you something." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you know?" I said, "I heard you and Marcus in the corridor on Saturday night. I heard enough." She was quiet. She said, "How much?" I said, "The reference thing, and that Marcus has known for 2 years." She was quiet for a longer time. She said, "I'm going to tell you everything. I need you to let me tell you everything before you respond." I said, "All right." She said, "When you were applying for the deputy director position at the Urban Development Council 14 years ago?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I had applied for that position too." I said, "I know. You told me you applied. You said you withdrew." She said, "I told you I withdrew." I didn't withdraw. I was rejected in the semi-final round. You made the final round. I said, "I know that. I made the final and didn't get it." She said, "You didn't get it because of what I told them when they called me for a reference?" I said nothing. She said, "I told them that you were an excellent analyst but that you had struggled with the leadership dimensions of project management. I told them that in my experience working with you, you had difficulty managing conflict within teams, and that I had seen you create tensions with colleagues in situations that required diplomatic handling." I said, "None of that is true." She said, "None of it is true." She said, "I told them those things because I wanted the position, and you were going to get it instead of me. And I had a phone call from their reference coordinator, and I said those things." I said, "You said those things." She said, "Yes." She said, And then the following year, when you applied for the program director role at Community Futures and they called me, I said similar things. And then 3 years after that for the policy director position at Urban Strategies. And then the senior director role at your current firm. I said, you were called as a reference for my current position. She said, yes. I didn't know if you put me on the list. I assumed you had. I assumed you always put me on the list. I said, I always put you on the list. She said, I know. She said, for your current position, I said that I had concerns about whether you had the organizational gravitas that a senior role required. I said, organizational gravitas. She said, those were my words. I know what they mean to hiring committees in our field. I said, why are you telling me this now? She said, because Marcus told me 2 years ago that he had overheard a call I had with someone from a search committee that was filling a position you had applied for. He heard what I said. He didn't tell me then. He told me at the end of our first year of dating that he had been thinking about it and he needed to know if I was still doing it. I said, were you? She said no. I stopped when Marcus told me he knew. I stopped because he knew, and I was ashamed, and because by then I had gotten the jobs I wanted, and I told myself it was over. I said, when did you stop? She said, 2 years ago. I said, so you did this for 14 years and stopped 2 years ago when someone found out? She said, yes. I said, and you have been my best friend for 23 years during all of this. She said, yes. I said, and you were my maid of honor last Saturday. She said, yes. I said, tell me why. She said, I don't know how to answer that in a way that is adequate to the question. I said, try anyway. I want to tell you what Carla said about why, not because the why excuses what she did, but because I spent a significant amount of time after that conversation trying to understand the full picture of what had happened, and the full picture includes the why. She said, in the beginning, when I called about the Urban Development Council position, I told myself it was just one time and that it was because I wanted that position and I was panicking and it came out before I had decided to say it. I told myself I would never do it again. She said, when they called for the second position, I had already told myself the first time that it would never happen again, and it happened again, and I understood that telling myself it would never happen again was something I had been using to make myself feel better about having done it, rather than something that was actually true. She said, after the second time, I understood that I was doing something that I had chosen to do, and that the choosing was not going to stop by itself. I said, but you kept doing it. She said, yes. She said, what I told myself was that you were going to be fine, that you were going to build your career and it was going to be fine, and the specific positions I had mentioned were positions I also wanted, and that it was competition, and that competition was a part of professional life. She said, I told myself that because I couldn't tell myself the truth, which was that I was sabotaging my best friend. I said, why were you afraid of competing with me? She was quiet. She said, because you were better than me. I said, what does that mean specifically? She said, it means that when we were both applying for positions, I knew that if the competition was fair, you were going to win most of them. You were more capable. Your work was better. Your relationships were better. Your reputation was better. The only thing that was sometimes in my favor was having more institutional tenure at certain points, and that wasn't always enough. She said, I couldn't bear the specific feeling of losing to you, not to someone else. To you? I said, why specifically to me? She was quiet for a long time. She said, because I had built my entire adult identity around being as good as you were, since Howard. You were the standard I was measuring myself against for 23 years. And in the moments when I was directly competing with you for specific things, losing to you meant something different than losing to other people. It meant something about the foundation of how I understood myself. I said, "So you undermined me instead?" She said, "Yes." I said, "For 14 years." She said, "Yes." I said, "And then called me from your honeymoon to bridal shop with you for your dress." She said nothing. I said, "And asked me to be your maid of honor." She said, "Rosalind." I said, "Tell me something specifically. Tell me one thing that is true about what our friendship has been while you were doing this." She said, "Everything else. Everything that was not the references. The calls and the visits and the conversations and the specific things we have said to each other across 23 years about what matters and who we are and what we want. All of that was real." I said, "You're saying the friendship was real except for the part where you sabotaged my career for 14 years. She said, "Yes. I know how that sounds." I said, "Tell me how it sounds to you." She said, "It sounds like someone who was capable of both things simultaneously, who could love her best friend genuinely and also be afraid of her best friend in a specific way that produced a specific harm for 14 years. She said, "I don't know how to explain that as a coherent thing. I only know that it was true." I sat with the phone in my hand and the specific weight of what had been said settling in the specific way of things that have been said that cannot be unsaid. I said, "I need time." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't know what comes after this." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to hang up now." She said, "Rosalind, I love you." "I know that doesn't—" I said, "I know you do. I'll call you when I'm ready." I hung up. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to say something directly to you before I continue. Have you ever had the specific experience of a truth arriving that reorganized not one thing but everything? Not a single event, but the entire context within which you had understood years of your life? And have you sat with the reorganized version and tried to understand what to do with it? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what I did in the months after that phone call is the part of this story that matters most to me, and that I want you to understand before I tell you how it ended. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. I did not call Carla for 4 months. I want to be precise about this because precision matters here. 4 months. 123 days between the Wednesday phone call and the Sunday afternoon when I called her back. I want to tell you what I did during those 4 months, because what I did is the center of this story, more central than the revelation, and more central than the eventual conversation with Carla, because what I did in those 4 months was the specific work of understanding something large enough that it required 4 months to understand properly. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Amara Williams, in the second week after the phone call. This was not a dramatic decision. It was the specific, pragmatic decision of someone who understood that the thing she was trying to process was too large to process alone, and who knew enough about herself to know that she needed a structured context for the processing. Dr. Williams is a Black woman therapist in Washington, D.C., who specializes in grief and relational trauma, which is the specific combination of focus that I needed, because what I was processing was the specific intersection of loss and betrayal that the revelation had produced. I want to describe what we worked through across those 4 months because I think the specifics are important. We worked through the obvious grief first, the direct loss of the friendship as I had understood it, the specific weight of understanding that 23 years of what I had believed was the most genuine relationship of my adult life had contained something I had not known about, and that had been shaping the trajectory of my professional life for 14 of those 23 years. Then, we worked through something less obvious, but more important. Dr. Williams asked me, in the 4th session, what I understood about what I would have built if Carla had not made those reference calls. I said, I would have gotten at least some of those positions, possibly all of them. She said, and what would you have built from those positions? I sat with that for a while. I said, a different career, probably a more senior one, probably with more institutional influence in my field. She said, "Is that what you want?" I said, "I thought it was." She said, "What do you want now?" I said, "I want to understand what I actually want, separately from what I was trying to get and couldn't." She said, "Say more about that." I said, "I spent 23 years in a specific professional trajectory that I understood as my own. I now know that part of what shaped that trajectory was an external factor I didn't know about. I'm trying to understand which parts of what I built were what I would have built anyway, and which parts were adaptations to a reality I didn't understand." She said, "And which parts do you want to keep?" This was the specific question that required 4 months to answer properly, not because the answer was complicated, but because it required me to examine 23 years of professional choices with the specific honesty of someone who now had information they had not previously had, and who needed to understand what they would have chosen with that information. What I came to understand, across those 4 months, was something I want to describe carefully because I think it is the most important thing this story contains. The career I had built was the career I had built. Not the career I would have built if Carla had not made those calls. Not a lesser version of an unrealized, larger career. The specific career I had actually built across 23 years of my own choices and my own work. I was genuinely good at the work I did. My clients trusted me. My colleagues respected me. The specific expertise I had developed was real and was valuable and was mine. What I had not gotten were 7 positions at organizations that would have been, in some respects, steps up from where I was. Those positions were real losses. The careers I might have built from those positions were real alternative trajectories that I had not taken, because someone had undermined my ability to take them. And also, I had built something specific and genuine and entirely my own. The something I had built might not have been exactly what I would have built without the sabotage. It was also something I had built. It was also mine. Dr. Williams said in our 7th session, "Rosalind, I want to ask you a question that I think might be difficult." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "If you had gotten any of those 7 positions, which version of the career you have now do you think you would have built from them?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "A different one." She said, "Necessarily better?" I sat with that. I said, "Not necessarily better. Necessarily different." She said, "What's in the career you built that you wouldn't trade?" I said, "The specific expertise I developed working in a boutique firm for 11 years, which I would not have developed if I had gone into senior leadership at a large organization at 32 or 35. The specific kind of independence that 11 years of consulting work gives you. The specific relationships I have with the clients I've worked with across this period." She said, "Those things are real." I said, "Yes." She said, "They're yours." I said, "Yes." She said, "What would you like to build from them going forward?" This was the question that changed the direction of the 4 months. What I decided to do across the last 6 weeks of the 4 months was the most significant professional decision of my adult life. I decided to start my own firm, not as a reaction to Carla. I want to be specific about this because I think the distinction matters. Not as revenge, not as proof of anything to anyone, not organized around the alternative career I had not built. Organized around what I understood about what I had actually built and what I wanted to build next. I had 11 years of specific expertise in organizational effectiveness work with nonprofits and public agencies. I had a network of relationships with clients who trusted my work and who would, I believed, continue to work with me in a different structure. I had a specific methodology I had developed across my work at the boutique firm that I had never been able to fully implement because I had been operating within someone else's organizational framework. I had everything I needed to build the specific thing I wanted to build. I called my attorney in the first week of October, 4 months after the wedding. I called 3 of my most significant clients in the second week of October. I gave notice at the boutique firm in the third week of October. I opened Achabe Strategies in January of the following year. I want to tell you what happened with Carla because that story has its own ending. I called her on a Sunday afternoon in the last week of October, the 123rd day. She answered on the first ring, the specific answer of someone who has been expecting a call for 4 months and who has been available for it from the first moment it became possible. I said, "I'm ready to talk." She said, "I'm here." I said, "I have some things I need to say, and then I want to hear what you have to say." She said, "Yes." I said, "What you did was wrong." Not in the vague way that people say something was wrong when they're trying to be fair. In the specific way of something that was deliberately harmful and sustained across 14 years, and that shaped the trajectory of my professional life in ways I did not know about and could not account for. I want you to understand that I know exactly what it cost, not just the specific positions. The 14 years of not understanding why certain things weren't working and thinking it was something about me that I couldn't see clearly. The specific psychological cost of a sustained pattern I couldn't diagnose because I didn't know what I was looking for. She said, "I understand." I said, "I don't think you fully understand yet, but I'm going to tell you something that might help." She said, "Please." I said, "I have been in therapy for 4 months processing what you told me, and the specific understanding I arrived at, the most important one, is that the career I built across 23 years is the career I built, not the career I would have built if you hadn't done what you did, not a lesser version of something larger I was supposed to have. My actual career, built from my actual choices and my actual work, and there are things in it that I would not have built from any of the 7 positions I applied for that are specifically valuable to me, that are mine in the particular complete way that things built through your own specific effort over time are yours." She said, "I'm glad." I said, "I'm not telling you that to make you feel better. I'm telling you because it's true and because truth is what I'm organizing around right now." She said, "I understand." I said, "I'm starting my own firm in January." She was quiet. She said, "You're starting your firm?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Rosalind." I said, "Don't." She was quiet. I said, "What I need from you now is this." She said, "Tell me." I said, "I need you to tell me whether you're capable of a friendship with me that is not organized around fear of me." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean that what you did for 14 years was organized around fear. Fear of competing with me fairly and losing. I need to know whether you're capable of being my friend without that fear being the thing underneath the friendship. Because if it is still the thing underneath, then we're not actually friends and we haven't been. And the 23 years was something else." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I've been in therapy too. Since before the wedding. Since Marcus told me he knew." I said, "I know." "Marcus told me when he called me 2 weeks after the wedding." She said, "He called you." I said, "Yes. He called to apologize for the corridor. He also told me you'd been in therapy and that he thought I should know that." She said, "I didn't know he called you." I said, "He said he didn't tell you because he wasn't sure you'd want to know." She said, "He was right that I wouldn't have wanted to know." I said, "I know. That's why he was right to do it anyway." She said, "Yes." She said, "To answer your question, I don't know if I'm fully capable of it yet. I'm working on the fear. 2 years of work on the fear. I know more about where it comes from than I knew before. I know that it's specific to you and specific to a particular way I've understood our relationship for 23 years that was not honest even to me." She said, "What I know is that I want to try. Not because I want to repair the friendship for my own sake, because you are the person I have known longest and most completely, and losing you is a specific loss that I don't want to accept without trying everything available to me to address what caused it." I said, That's the most honest thing you've said to me in this conversation. She said, I'm trying. I said, I know. I said, I'm not going to tell you whether we're still friends right now. I'm going to tell you that I'm willing to find out. And finding out is going to require you to be honest with me in ways you haven't been for 14 years, and it's going to require me to pay attention to things I should have paid more attention to before. She said, I can do that. I said, I know you can try. Whether you can do it is what we're going to find out. Achebi Strategies opened in January. I will not describe the opening in the way of someone who needs to make a dramatic story of a professional beginning, because the beginning was what beginnings are, which is specific and unglamorous and full of the particular work of building something new from the things you have already built. What I will tell you is that 3 of the clients I had worked with at the boutique firm came with me, the specific 3 who knew my work most closely, and whose specific organizational challenges were exactly the kind that the methodology I had developed was designed to address. In the first year, I added 4 new clients. In the second year, I hired my first employee, a young woman named Keisha, who had the particular combination of analytical capability and relational intelligence that the work required. In the third year, which is the year I am currently in, I have 12 active client relationships and 3 employees, and a practice that is doing the specific work I have always wanted to do in the specific way I have always wanted to do it. I want to tell you something about what the firm does that is directly relevant to the rest of this story. Part of what Achebi Strategies does is leadership recruitment support, helping organizations think through their candidate processes and their reference check processes and the specific ways in which those processes can be improved to produce more accurate and equitable outcomes. I developed this practice area specifically because of what I now understood about how reference checks could be manipulated and what better practices looked like, and it has become, in its first 2 years, one of the most in-demand aspects of what we offer. I built from what happened to me, not as revenge, as genuine work. The understanding I had of how reference processes could fail was real knowledge, hard-won, and it was useful to the organizations I work with, and useful to the candidates whose opportunities depend on those processes working fairly. This is what I mean when I say I built from what I had. I want to tell you what happened with Carla's professional life, because it happened without my involvement and without my intention, and I want to be specific about that. Marcus called me in April of the first year after the wedding. He called to tell me something that had happened, that he thought I should know about. That was not something I had caused, and that he wanted me to hear from him before I heard some other way. One of the positions Carla had undermined me for, the Urban Development Council Deputy Director position 14 years earlier, had a board member who was now serving on a search committee for a position Carla had applied for. The search committee had contacted the Urban Development Council's former executive director as part of their research, a routine due diligence process. The former executive director, who had left the position 12 years ago but who maintained relationships in the field, had mentioned, in the course of that conversation, that they had been surprised, after the candidate they had preferred had not been selected, to learn that the reference process had produced a different picture than they had expected. The conversation had not been about Carla specifically. It had been about the specific pattern the executive director had observed in his years of nonprofit leadership, of reference processes producing outcomes that did not match the direct assessments made by search committees. The search committee member had mentioned the conversation to another member of the committee. The other committee member knew Carla. The connection between the reference check anomaly the executive director had described and Carla's role as one of the references for that position 14 years ago was not something that had been established or asserted in any formal way. It was a specific piece of professional reputation context that had entered the field's informal circulation in the way that professional reputation context enters informal circulation, which is through the specific conversations that people who have worked in a field for many years have with other people who have worked in that field for many years. Carla did not get the position she had applied for. Marcus told me this with the specific quality of someone who understood that what he was telling me was not something I had caused, and who needed me to know that he understood that. He said, "I'm not telling you this because I think you had anything to do with it. I know you didn't. I'm telling you because I think you're going to hear about it, and I wanted you to hear the full picture." I said, "I appreciate you telling me." He said, "How are you doing with all of it?" I said, "I'm building something good." He said, "I know. Carla talks about it." I said, "What does she say?" He said, "She says you built what you were always going to build, and that the only difference is you're building it later and in a different form than you would have built it in a different set of circumstances." I said, "That's accurate." He said, "She's also proud of you," which is complicated. She said that too. I said, "I know." He said, "She told me to tell you that if the pride feels hollow given everything, she understands." I said, "It doesn't feel hollow. It feels like Carla understanding something true about me and telling me she understands it, which is something she's always been capable of when she was being honest." He said, "I'll tell her you said that. The friendship with Carla is not what it was before I knew what she had done. I want to be honest about this because honesty is what this story is about, and pretending the friendship returned entirely to what it was before would be a specific form of dishonesty that the rest of the story does not deserve. What it is now is different, more careful, more explicitly honest in the specific way of something that has been examined carefully rather than taken for granted. We speak once a week rather than the 3 or 4 times a week that characterized the friendship before. The conversations are specific rather than comprehensive. The particular conversations of people who are in the process of rebuilding something on a more honest foundation, rather than the expansive conversations of people who have never needed to think about the foundation. She is not my maid of honor anymore. She is my friend. The specific distinction matters. I do not know yet what the friendship is going to be 10 years from now. I know what it is now, which is 2 people who have known each other for 26 years, and who are trying, with the full information of what happened between them, to find what is true and sustainable in what they have. Some things are. The conversations that matter. The specific quality of her mind and the specific quality of how she sees me, when she is seeing me honestly. The particular ease of a relationship that has 26 years of shared history and shared language. Some things I do not know yet. What I know is that I built something from what happened to me, not only affirm, an understanding of what I was building and why and what it was worth. The 4 months of therapy and the 123 days and the specific work of examining 23 years of professional and personal life with the full information I had not previously had produced something I did not have before, which was clarity about what I wanted that was not organized around what I had been unable to get. I wanted to build the specific thing I was capable of building. I am building it. Here is what a drunk man in a corridor at a wedding and 23 years of a complicated friendship and 4 months of therapy and the deliberate decision to build something specific from what I had taught me. I know that the people who love us are not always capable of loving us without fear, and that fear can produce harm in people who are genuinely loving us, and that the genuineness of the love and the reality of the harm are simultaneously true and do not cancel each other out. Carla loved me for 23 years and was afraid of me for 23 years, and the love was real, and the fear was real, and the harm the fear produced was real, and all 3 things are simultaneously true. I know that the career you built in the circumstances you were in is the career you built, and that the alternative career you might have built in different circumstances is a useful object of thought, but not the standard against which your actual career should be measured. I built something across 23 years that was shaped by the circumstances I was in, which included circumstances I didn't know about. What I built is mine. It is also genuinely good. I know that the specific work of understanding what you would have built in different circumstances, and what you actually built in your circumstances, and what you want to build going forward with the full information you now have, is the most important work available to you after a revelation like the one I experienced. not the revelation itself. The work the revelation makes possible, and I know that a drunk man in a hallway at his own wedding, who loved his new wife, and who also understood that there was something she needed to tell her best friend, did something that cost him something in the early months of his marriage because he believed it was the right thing to do. Marcus Brandt is not in this story as a minor character. He is in this story as someone who told the truth at a cost to himself because he believed the person who needed to know the truth deserved to know it. I have told him once that I am grateful. He said, I told Carla she needed to tell you, and she said she would, and then she didn't. I thought someone needed to say something that night. I said too much in that hallway and not enough, but it got to the same place eventually. I said, it did. He said, how are you? I said, I'm building something good. He said, I know. I've been watching. That is my story. A corridor at a wedding, 23 years of a complicated